There are two words that shape more of your life than almost anything else you will ever encounter, and you use them every single day without giving them a second thought. I am. Whatever you attach to those two words becomes the quiet instruction your mind follows, over and over, until it slowly turns into the life you are actually living. Right now, before you have even finished this sentence, you are already carrying beliefs about who you are, what you deserve, and what you are capable of. And most of these beliefs were never chosen consciously. They were simply absorbed, repeated, and accepted, until they started to feel like facts instead of decisions. This book is going to walk you through exactly how that happens, and more importantly, how to change it. You will learn why your imagination is not something reserved for daydreaming, but a real tool you can train deliberately. You will learn why the feelings you carry underneath the surface often matter more than the thoughts sitting on top. You will learn how to release old beliefs that have been quietly running your life for years without your permission, and how to build a new self-image through simple daily practice. Nothing in the chapters ahead requires special talent or perfect conditions. It only requires your willingness to keep showing up. By the end, you will understand something most people never fully grasp. The life you want is not waiting for permission from the outside world. It begins the moment you change what follows those two small, powerful words. Chapter 1. Discover how your inner identity shapes your outer life. You stand every single day at the edge of two different lives. One life is the one you are currently living, the one your eyes can see, the one your hands can touch, the one that shows up in your bank account, your relationships, your body, your daily routine. The other life is the one that exists inside you right now, fully formed, waiting patiently, quietly, for you to claim it. Most people never realize that these two lives are connected by a single thread, and that thread is identity. Not your job title, not your reputation, not what other people call you. Your identity is the private conversation you have with yourself when no one else is listening. It is the quiet sentence that begins with, I am, and ends with whatever word you have chosen, consciously or unconsciously, to attach to yourself. And that sentence, repeated silently, thousands of times a day, is building the world you walk through. This is the first truth you must understand if you want your life to change, and it is not a comfortable truth, because it removes every excuse. Your outer life is not random. It is not the result of luck, timing, other people's decisions, or the economy. Your outer life is the shadow cast by your inner identity. Change the identity, and eventually, without force, without struggle, without begging the world for permission, the shadow changes too. This is not wishful thinking. This is how a disciplined mind operates. A person who has trained themselves to think clearly understands that the external world is downstream from the internal world. You do not fix your life by rearranging furniture on the outside. You fix your life by rearranging the furniture on the inside, and the outside eventually reflects the change because it has no other choice. Consider how you talk about yourself right now, today, without editing for anyone. When something goes wrong, what sentence comes out of your mouth first? Do you say, "That's just how I am," when you fail to follow through on something? Do you say, "I'm not good with money," when you overspend? Do you say, "I'm not a disciplined person," when you skip the gym for the third day in a row? Every one of these statements feels small in the moment, almost harmless, like a passing comment about the weather. But these statements are not harmless. They are declarations. They are votes you are casting for the kind of person you intend to remain. And your mind, which is far more obedient than most people realize, takes these declarations seriously. It does not judge whether the statement is helping you or hurting you. It simply accepts the instruction and gets to work making it true. This is the quiet tragedy of most human lives. People spend decades complaining about a life that their own words, spoken in private, have been building brick by brick. Here is where the discipline comes in, because this is not a chapter about positive thinking in the shallow sense. Positive thinking without discipline is just decoration. What you need is precision. You need to catch yourself in the act of self-definition and interrupt the pattern the moment it appears. This requires the same kind of attention a soldier gives to guarding a border. You would not let an untrained stranger walk freely into your home and rearrange your furniture, yet most people let random, careless thoughts walk freely into their identity and rearrange their entire future without ever standing guard at the door. The discipline of identity begins with listening to yourself the way a wise teacher listens to a student, noticing every time you define yourself downward and calmly, without drama, refusing to accept the definition. Try this today, right after you finish reading this chapter. Spend 1 hour paying close attention to your inner speech. Do not try to control it yet. Just observe it the way you would observe weather patterns, with curiosity and no judgment. Notice how many times you silently or audibly attach a limiting label to yourself. I'm always late. I'm terrible at this. I never finish what I start. I'm just not that kind of person. Write these phrases down if you can, even just 3 or 4 of them, because seeing them on paper strips them of their disguise. On paper, they stop looking like harmless observations and start looking like what they actually are, instructions you have been giving your own mind, over and over, until your mind believed you and built a life to match. Once you can see these instructions clearly, the next step is replacement, not denial. Denial is fragile and does not hold up under pressure. If you tell yourself, I am not lazy, while secretly still feeling lazy, the mind senses the contradiction and rejects the statement. Real change comes from a different kind of sentence, one built on the identity you are choosing to grow into, spoken with calm certainty rather than desperate hope. Instead of fighting the old label, you simply stop feeding it and begin feeding a new one. Instead of, I am not lazy, you practice, I am someone who follows through, and you say it not as a wish, but as a description of the person you have already decided to become. This is not about lying to yourself. It is about choosing, deliberately, which version of yourself you are going to strengthen with your attention, because whatever you keep your attention on grows stronger, and whatever you starve of attention eventually fades. This process takes patience, and patience is where most people give up too early. They repeat a new identity statement 3 or 4 times, notice that their life has not transformed overnight, and conclude that the practice does not work. But consider how long the old identity took to build. Years of repetition, years of small moments, years of quiet agreement with a limiting label, all compounding silently in the background. You cannot expect to undo years of quiet agreement with a few days of effort. The mind does not work on your impatient schedule. It works on the schedule of consistent repetition. A disciplined person understands this and does not need instant proof to continue the practice. They continue because they understand the mechanism, the same way a farmer plants seeds without demanding to see the harvest the next morning. The farmer trusts the process because the farmer understands how growth works. You must develop this same trust in the process of identity, understanding that what you plant today in your private thoughts is quietly growing roots long before it shows up as visible fruit in your outer life. Now think about the real-world moments where this matters most, because philosophy without application is just noise. Picture the moment right before a difficult conversation, the kind where your hands feel a little tense and your throat feels a little tight. In that moment, your identity speaks first, before your mouth does. If your private identity is, I am someone who avoids conflict, you will find a way to soften your words until your real message disappears, and you will walk away feeling smaller than you did before the conversation started. But if you have been quietly training a different identity, one built on the sentence, I am someone who speaks the truth calmly, something shifts. Not because the fear disappears completely, but because a new instruction is now available to your mind, and under pressure, the mind reaches for whatever instruction has been repeated most often. Picture another moment, the one that happens every single morning when the alarm goes off and your body wants 5 more minutes of comfort. This moment feels small, almost insignificant, but it is one of the most honest tests of identity you will face all day. If your private identity is, I am someone who struggles with mornings, you will negotiate with yourself, and you will lose that negotiation 9 times out of 10, because you are only doing what your identity has already decided you would do. But the moment you shift the inner sentence to, I am someone who keeps commitments to myself, getting out of bed stops being a battle of willpower and becomes simply an act of alignment. You are not fighting yourself anymore. You are just being who you already decided to be. This is the real power hidden inside identity work, and it is far more practical than most people realize. Willpower is exhausting because it requires you to fight your own self-image every single time. Identity is efficient because once the self-image changes, the actions that used to require enormous effort start to feel natural, almost automatic. This is why some people seem to have discipline without struggle, while others white-knuckle their way through every small task. The difference is rarely talent. The difference is almost always identity. The disciplined person is not fighting harder. They have simply stopped arguing with themselves about who they are. There is a deeper layer to this as well, one that touches something more tender than habits and morning routines. The way you define yourself privately affects how safe you feel in the world, how worthy you feel of good things, how much peace you allow yourself to experience even when circumstances are difficult. A person who has quietly decided, I am someone who survives hard things, carries a different posture through life than a person who has decided, I am someone who is broken by hard things. Both people may face the exact same difficulty, the exact same loss, the exact same disappointment, but they will walk through it differently, and they will come out the other side differently, because the identity they carry shapes not just their actions but their capacity to endure. This is not about pretending pain does not exist. Real strength never denies pain. Real strength simply refuses to let pain write the final sentence about who you are. So here is what is asked of you now, plainly, without decoration. Begin tonight, before you sleep, by writing down 3 sentences that begin with, I am, describing not who you have been, but who you are choosing to become. Keep them simple. Keep them honest enough that part of you can believe them, even if another part of you still doubts. Read them quietly to yourself in the morning, before you check your phone, before the noise of the day has a chance to hand you someone else's opinion of who you should be. Read them again at night, calmly, the way you would speak to someone you respect. This is not a magic ritual. This is training, the same kind of training that builds any strength worth having, slow, repeated, unglamorous, and completely within your control. Your outer life has been shaped, quietly and consistently, by the identity you have been repeating to yourself, whether you meant to or not. That truth can feel heavy at first, almost like an accusation, but sit with it a little longer and you will find something far more valuable underneath it. If your private words built the life you currently have, then your private words, spoken differently from this day forward, can build the life you actually want. Nothing outside of you needs to change first. No one needs to give you permission. No circumstance needs to improve before you begin. The starting point has always been available to you, quietly waiting behind 2 simple words, and the moment you choose to speak them with intention, instead of accident, you take the first real step toward becoming the person your future is patiently waiting for. Chapter 2. Awaken, the creative power hidden within your imagination. Imagination is not a luxury reserved for artists and dreamers sitting quietly in some faraway studio. Imagination is a working tool, available to you right now, in this very moment, and it is far more powerful than most people ever give it credit for. Somewhere along the way, imagination got demoted in the minds of grown adults. It got filed away as something for children, something for fiction, something separate from the serious business of building a real life. This is one of the most costly misunderstandings a person can carry, because imagination is not separate from your real life. Imagination is the workshop where your real life gets built before it ever becomes visible to your eyes. Think about anything you have ever owned, worn, or lived inside of. Before it existed physically, it existed as a picture inside someone's mind. The chair you are sitting in right now was once nothing but an idea inside a designer's imagination. The building around you was once lines drawn on paper because someone pictured it first. Nothing in the physical world arrives before it arrives in the mind. This is not poetry, this is the actual sequence of how creation works, every single time, without exception. And if this is true for chairs and buildings, it is equally true for the shape of your days, the quality of your relationships, and the direction of your future. You are already using your imagination every single day, whether you realize it or not. The only question is whether you are using it on purpose or letting it run wild without supervision. Most people imagine their failures in vivid detail and their successes only in vague, foggy outlines. Notice how easily a person can picture, with full clarity, the embarrassment of messing up a presentation, complete with the sound of their own voice cracking, and the imagined expressions on other people's faces. Now ask that same person to picture, with equal clarity, the presentation going well. Suddenly the image gets blurry, distant, hard to hold on to. This imbalance is not an accident of personality, it is a habit, built through repetition, and like any habit, it can be retrained. The mind will happily construct whatever scene you keep feeding it attention, and right now, for most people, fear gets fed far more often than hope does. This chapter is about reversing that pattern deliberately, with discipline, until imagining good outcomes becomes just as natural as imagining bad ones used to be. Here is where the real training begins, and it starts with something almost embarrassingly simple: closing your eyes and building a scene. Not a vague wish, not a foggy hope, but an actual scene, complete with detail. If you want a calmer household, do not just think the word calm. Picture the specific moment. See yourself walking through the front door after work. Feel your shoulders relax. Hear the quiet. Notice the small smile on your own face, because nothing is on fire and nothing needs fixing right this second. The more senses you involve, the more real the scene becomes to your mind, because the mind does not experience imagination as separate from memory. As far as your inner world is concerned, a vividly imagined scene and a vividly remembered scene are processed through very similar channels. This is why a well-built imagined scene can leave you feeling calmer, more confident, or more motivated, even though nothing has physically happened yet. You are not pretending, you are rehearsing. Athletes have known this for decades, long before it became fashionable to talk about mindset. A skilled athlete does not simply show up on competition day and hope for the best. They spend hours beforehand picturing the exact movement, the exact form, the exact feeling of success, over and over, until the body seems to already know what to do, before it has physically practiced the moment in real life. This is not magic. This is imagination used as a serious training tool. If it works for a muscle, it works for a mindset. If it works for a jump shot, it works for a difficult conversation, a job interview, a new habit, or a complete change in how you carry yourself through the world. Now, discipline matters here more than most people expect, because the untrained mind does not like to sit still in a single scene. It wants to wander, add doubts, insert worst-case scenarios halfway through your carefully built picture. This is normal, and it is not a sign of failure. It is simply a sign that the mind has been trained, through years of repetition, to default toward worry. When you notice this wandering happen, do not fight it with frustration. Gently, calmly, bring the scene back into focus, the same way you would guide a curious child back to the table during dinner. No drama, no self-criticism, just steady redirection. Over time, with repetition, the mind becomes easier to guide, the same way any skill becomes easier with practice. A practical way to build this skill is to set aside a few quiet minutes, ideally at the start or end of your day, when the noise of obligations has not yet crowded your mind or has finally settled down. Sit somewhere comfortable, close your eyes, and choose one specific outcome you want to move toward. Not 10 outcomes. 1. Build the scene slowly. What are you doing in this scene? What does your posture look like? What is the tone of your voice? What small details surround you? The lighting in the room, the sounds nearby, the temperature in the air. Stay in this scene for a few minutes, breathing naturally, letting the feeling of it settle into your body the way warmth settles into a cold room. This is not a fantasy escape from your life. This is quiet, focused rehearsal for the life you are building. Something important needs to be said clearly here, because this practice can easily be misunderstood as passive daydreaming, and that misunderstanding weakens its entire purpose. Imagination is not a replacement for action. It is preparation for action. A person who spends time picturing themselves speaking with calm confidence is not doing this instead of practicing the actual conversation. They are doing this so that when the real moment arrives, their nervous system already recognizes the scene as familiar territory instead of unknown danger. This is the same principle behind why soldiers train through simulation before facing real combat, why pilots use flight simulators before flying real planes, why surgeons rehearse difficult procedures mentally before ever picking up the scalpel. Rehearsal reduces fear, not by pretending fear does not exist, but by making the unfamiliar familiar ahead of time. There is also a quieter, more personal layer to this practice, one that touches identity directly. The scenes you repeatedly imagine about yourself slowly become the scenes you expect from yourself. If you consistently picture yourself handling pressure with steadiness, your mind begins to treat steadiness under pressure as normal, as expected, as simply who you are. This is how imagination and identity work together, feeding each other in a quiet loop. The pictures shape the identity, and the identity shapes which pictures feel natural to imagine next. This is why starting the practice matters more than doing it perfectly. Even a slightly wobbly, imperfect imagined scene, repeated with consistency, begins to shift what feels normal and possible to you. Resistance will show up, and it deserves to be named honestly rather than glossed over. Some part of you may feel foolish sitting quietly and picturing a better version of your life, while your current circumstances look nothing like that picture yet. This feeling is common, and it does not mean you are doing something wrong. It means you are doing something unfamiliar, and unfamiliar things almost always feel a little foolish at first, right up until they become normal through repetition. The discomfort is not evidence against the practice. It is simply evidence that you are stretching a muscle that has not been used very often. Push through the discomfort with patience, not force, the same way you would push through the early awkwardness of learning any new physical skill. Consider, too, how this practice interacts with the difficulties you cannot control. Life will still hand you real problems, real setbacks, real days where nothing goes according to plan. Imagination does not erase difficulty, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you a shortcut that does not exist. What imagination does offer is a steady internal reference point, a picture you can return to even on hard days, reminding your mind what you are building toward, even when the current moment looks nothing like it yet. This steady reference point becomes an anchor. Without it, difficulty can feel like proof that things will never improve. With it, difficulty becomes simply a rough patch on a road that still leads somewhere specific, because you have already walked that road, quietly, inside your own mind, dozens of times before. Begin today, not with grand ambition, but with one small, clear scene. Choose something specific, something you can picture in real detail, something that matters to you personally rather than something borrowed from someone else's definition of success. Sit with it for a few focused minutes. Let it feel real, even briefly. Then return to it again tomorrow, and the day after, building the habit the same patient way you would build any strength worth having. Your imagination has been working this entire time, shaping your expectations, your fears, and your sense of what is possible, whether you were guiding it or not. The moment you decide to guide it on purpose, with discipline and consistency, you stop being a passenger inside your own mind and start becoming the one who is actually driving. There is a difference between thinking something and feeling something, and most people spend their entire lives never learning that difference clearly enough to use it. A thought can pass through your mind and leave almost no trace, gone within seconds, forgotten by lunchtime. But a feeling, especially one you return to again and again, settles into you differently. It sinks below the surface of conscious awareness and starts operating quietly in the background, shaping how you interpret events, how you speak to people, how you carry your body through a room. This is why simply thinking positive words, while still feeling defeated underneath, rarely changes anything. The words are just noise on the surface, the feeling is the current running underneath, and the current is what actually moves the boat. Consider how a feeling of unworthiness operates in someone's life, quietly, without announcing itself. This person may say all the right things out loud. They may even believe on an intellectual level that they deserve good things. But underneath that belief sits a feeling, formed years earlier, maybe from a harsh comment, maybe from repeated disappointment, maybe from watching someone they loved struggle, and unconsciously deciding that struggle is simply what life offers people like them. That feeling does not need permission to keep operating. It shows up in the job they do not apply for because part of them expects rejection before they even try. It shows up in the relationship they settle for because part of them does not expect to be chosen by something better. It shows up in the way they downplay their own achievements, almost apologizing for succeeding because success feels unfamiliar and slightly dangerous to a feeling that has grown comfortable with disappointment. None of this is dramatic or obvious from the outside. It is quiet, consistent, and incredibly effective at shaping outcomes. Now compare this to a person who carries a feeling of quiet capability, not arrogance, just steady trust in their own ability to handle whatever shows up. This person faces the exact same kind of setback, a lost opportunity, a difficult conversation, an unexpected obstacle, and something different happens inside them. The setback registers as information, not identity. They do not need to convince themselves they are capable through forced positive statements, because the feeling of capability is already present, already running quietly underneath the surface, already shaping how they respond, before they even consciously decide how to respond. This is the real difference between two people facing similar circumstances and ending up in very different places over time. It was rarely about talent. It was almost always about which feeling was running the show underneath the surface. This is not an abstract idea meant to sound impressive. It is something you can observe directly in your own daily life if you pay close enough attention. Think about the last time you walked into a room feeling anxious, even if nothing specific had happened yet that day. Notice how everything seemed to confirm the anxiety once it was already present. A neutral comment from someone felt slightly like criticism. A normal silence felt slightly like tension. Nothing had actually changed in the room, but your feeling had already decided what kind of room this was going to be, and your mind obediently found evidence to match. This happens constantly in nearly every area of life, and most people never notice it happening because they assume their feelings are simply reactions to what is already there. Rarely do people stop to consider that the feeling arrived first and quietly recruited the evidence afterward. This is precisely why managing your feelings deserves the same seriousness you would give to managing your finances or your health. A feeling left unexamined does not stay neutral. It grows roots. It becomes familiar. And familiar feelings have a strange kind of gravity, pulling your circumstances toward whatever shape matches them, not through some mysterious force, but through the very practical mechanism of shaping your attention, your choices, your posture, your tone of voice, and your willingness to try. Two people can face the same opportunity, and the one carrying a feeling of confidence will speak with more clarity, hold eye contact a little longer, ask better questions, and simply come across as more trustworthy, not because they are pretending, but because the feeling underneath is genuinely different, and people sense that difference even when they cannot name it. So how does someone actually change a feeling that has been running quietly in the background for years? not through force, and not through denial. You cannot simply command yourself to stop feeling anxious or unworthy, the same way you cannot command a muscle to grow overnight. Change happens through repeated, deliberate practice, the same discipline required to build any other strength. It begins with honest observation. Before you can change a feeling, you need to notice it clearly, without judging yourself for having it. Throughout your day, pause occasionally and simply ask yourself, quietly, what am I actually feeling right now, underneath the surface activity? Not what you think you should be feeling, not what would look good to admit. What is actually there? This single habit, practiced consistently, starts to reveal patterns you may have been carrying for years without ever naming them directly. Once a feeling is named clearly, the next step is deciding, deliberately, which feeling you want to cultivate instead, and then practicing it the same way you would practice any skill, through repetition in calm, quiet moments, rather than trying to force it during moments of high pressure. If you want to build a feeling of calm confidence, do not wait for a stressful meeting to try it out for the first time. Practice it in small, low-stakes moments throughout your ordinary day. While making your morning coffee, take a slow breath and deliberately settle into a feeling of quiet steadiness, holding it for even 30 seconds. While walking to your car, practice holding a feeling of ease in your shoulders and your breathing. These moments seem small, almost insignificant, but they are training sessions, building familiarity with a feeling so that when a real test arrives, your body and mind already recognize the feeling as something you know how to access, rather than something completely foreign you are attempting for the first time under pressure. There is also real value in examining where your current feelings actually came from, not to dwell on the past with blame, but to understand the origin clearly enough to loosen its grip. A feeling of scarcity, for example, often traces back to a specific period, a specific household, a specific set of circumstances that made scarcity feel like the only available reality at the time. Understanding this does not erase the feeling instantly, but it does something important. It separates the feeling from the idea that it is simply an unchangeable part of who you are. A feeling that was learned can be unlearned. A feeling that was built through repetition can be rebuilt through different repetition. This understanding alone removes a significant amount of the hopelessness that keeps people stuck, because hopelessness itself is just another feeling, and like every other feeling, it can be examined, questioned, and eventually replaced with something more useful. Patience matters enormously here, because old feelings do not disappear the moment you decide to replace them. They tend to resurface, especially during moments of stress or fatigue, almost like an old habit trying to reassert itself. This is not failure. This is simply how deeply rooted patterns behave when they are being challenged for the first time in years. The discipline required is not the discipline of never feeling the old pattern again. It is the discipline of noticing when it resurfaces and gently, without self-criticism, redirecting yourself back toward the feeling you are choosing to build instead. Over time, with enough repetition, the new feeling becomes the default, and the old one becomes the occasional visitor instead of the permanent resident. Real-world application of this principle shows up most clearly in how you handle uncertainty, because uncertainty offers no concrete facts to hold on to, which means your feelings fill in the blanks almost entirely. Two people can wait for the exact same piece of uncertain news, a medical result, a decision from an employer, an answer from someone important to them, and one person will spend the waiting period gripped by dread, while the other spends it in a state of steady, grounded patience. The outcome, when it finally arrives, is identical for both people. But the quality of their days leading up to that outcome was shaped entirely by the feeling each of them chose, consciously or unconsciously, to inhabit during the waiting. This is where the real power of this principle becomes practical rather than philosophical. You may not control every outcome in your life, but you have far more influence than you realize over which feeling accompanies you while you move through your days, and that feeling is doing far more work, shaping far more of your actual experience than most people ever stop to consider. Begin paying closer attention starting today. Notice the feeling running underneath your ordinary moments, not just the dramatic ones. Choose, with real intention, which feeling you want to strengthen through practice, and give it the same patient repetition you would give any skill worth building. The feelings you hold on to most consistently are quietly shaping the reality you keep walking into, and the moment you take responsibility for choosing them deliberately is the moment you stop being shaped by accident and start being shaped by design. Chapter 4. Master. The practice of assuming your desired identity. There is a specific moment that separates people who eventually change their lives from people who talk about changing their lives for years without ever actually doing it, and that moment is smaller than most people expect. It is not the moment of achieving the goal, it is the moment of assuming the identity of someone who has already achieved it, long before the proof shows up. This is a strange idea to sit with at first, almost backward compared to how most people were taught to think about success. Most people believe you become confident after you succeed, become disciplined after you see results, become worthy after you accomplish something impressive. But this order rarely works in practice, because the actions that lead to success require the identity first. You cannot consistently act like a disciplined person while privately still identifying as someone who struggles with discipline. The private identity always wins the argument eventually, no matter how much willpower you throw at it in the short term. Assuming an identity does not mean pretending in a shallow way, and this distinction matters enormously. Pretending is hollow. It is performing for an audience, hoping no one notices the gap between the performance and the truth underneath. Assumption is different. Assumption means stepping fully into a way of being, privately, quietly, with complete seriousness, the same way an actor of real skill does not simply recite lines but actually inhabits a character from the inside, thinking their thoughts, carrying their posture, responding to situations the way that character would respond. The difference between shallow pretending and real assumption is commitment. Shallow pretending breaks the moment things get difficult. Real assumption holds steady precisely because it was never dependent on outside validation in the first place. Think about what it actually means, moment to moment, to assume the identity of a disciplined person rather than simply hoping to become one someday. It means that when the alarm goes off and your body wants 5 more minutes, you do not ask yourself whether you feel like getting up. A disciplined person does not run every action through a filter of momentary feeling. They simply get up, because that is what a disciplined person does, and you have already decided, in advance, that this is who you are. This removes an enormous amount of the internal negotiation that exhausts most people before they even start their day. The negotiation only exists for someone who has not yet assumed the identity. For someone who has assumed it fully, the action follows automatically, the same way a person who identifies as someone who brushes their teeth every morning does not debate the decision each day. It is simply already settled. This might sound almost too simple to matter, but simplicity is not the same as ease. Assuming a new identity, especially one that contradicts years of evidence from your past, requires real discipline, because your mind will offer resistance in the form of memory. It will remind you of every time you failed to follow through before, every time you gave up, every reason the old identity felt more accurate than the new one you are trying to assume. This resistance is not a sign that you are doing something wrong. It is simply the old identity defending its territory, the same way any established pattern resists being replaced. The discipline required here is the discipline of choosing the new identity anyway, repeatedly, especially in the exact moments when the old evidence feels loudest and most convincing. A practical way to begin this practice is through small, specific decisions rather than sweeping, vague declarations. Vague declarations like, "I am a successful person," are difficult to hold on to because they offer nothing concrete to act on in the next 5 minutes. Instead, choose something specific and immediate. If you are assuming the identity of someone who handles money wisely, Do not simply repeat the phrase in your head while continuing your old spending patterns unchanged. Look at your very next financial decision today, however small, and ask what a person who handles money wisely would actually do in this exact situation. Then do that. This single small action, repeated across dozens of small decisions, builds the new identity far more effectively than any amount of repeated affirmation without matching action, because the mind pays closer attention to what you actually do than to what you merely say. There is a quiet but important detail here that many people miss entirely. Assuming a new identity does not mean waiting until you feel completely convinced before acting. If you wait for full conviction, you will wait indefinitely, because conviction tends to arrive after repeated action, not before it. The correct order is uncomfortable at first. Act from the new identity while only partially believing it, and let the belief catch up gradually through the evidence your own actions provide. Every time you act in alignment with the identity you are assuming, even shakily, even with some private doubt still lingering, you hand your mind a small piece of evidence that the new identity is real. Enough small pieces of evidence, collected consistently over time, eventually outweigh the old evidence that used to support the identity you are leaving behind. Consider how this plays out in a real situation many people face, walking into a room full of people they consider more accomplished or more confident than themselves. The old identity whispers to shrink, to stay quiet, to avoid drawing attention in case of embarrassment. Assuming a new identity, one built on quiet self-respect, does not mean suddenly becoming loud or performative. It means simply carrying yourself the way someone with quiet self-respect actually carries themselves, standing at your natural height instead of curling inward, speaking when you have something worth saying instead of staying silent out of fear, listening fully instead of mentally rehearsing an apology for existing in the room. None of this requires external permission. It only requires the private decision, made and remade consistently, to occupy the identity rather than wait for someone else to grant it to you. Setbacks will happen during this practice, and they deserve honest acknowledgement rather than being brushed aside. There will be days you slip back into old patterns, days the new identity feels distant and unconvincing, days it seems easier to simply accept the old, familiar version of yourself because it requires less effort to maintain. This is not evidence that the practice has failed. It is simply evidence that identity change is not a straight line, the same way physical strength does not build in a perfectly smooth upward curve either. What matters is the general direction over time, not the perfection of every single day. A person who slips occasionally but returns consistently to the assumed identity will, over months, look entirely different from someone who never attempted the practice at all, regardless of how many individual slips occurred along the way. There is also something worth saying about the discomfort of assuming an identity before your circumstances have caught up to match it. This discomfort is often mistaken for a sign of dishonesty, as if claiming an identity you have not yet fully proven makes you a fraud. But this misunderstands how identity actually forms in the first place. No one waits until they have already mastered patience to begin practicing patience. No one waits until they are already strong to begin lifting weight. Every skill, every trait, every version of a person that eventually became real started as something assumed before it was fully earned, practiced imperfectly, in private, long before it was recognized publicly. The discomfort you feel while assuming a new identity is not proof that you are lying to yourself. It is simply proof that you are standing at the edge of genuine growth, and growth, by its very nature, always feels slightly unfamiliar before it feels natural. Begin today by choosing one specific identity you want to assume, something concrete enough that you can act on it within the next hour, not just believe it as a distant future concept. Carry yourself, speak, and make decisions the way that identity would, even before you feel fully convinced, even before the outside world has offered you any proof. The proof will come, gradually, built from the accumulated weight of your own consistent actions, but it will always come after the decision to assume the identity, never before. This is the quiet discipline at the center of real transformation, choosing who you are before the evidence arrives, and trusting that the evidence follows the choice rather than the other way around. Chapter 5. Release old beliefs that no longer serve your growth. Every belief you carry right now was installed at some point, by someone, somewhere, under some specific set of circumstances. None of your beliefs arrived pre-installed at birth. A child does not enter the world already convinced that money is hard to come by, that love always ends in disappointment, or that mistakes are dangerous and embarrassing. These beliefs get built piece by piece, usually during childhood, usually by people who were themselves simply repeating beliefs handed down to them without much examination. This matters enormously, because if a belief was built through repetition and experience, it can also be dismantled through the same process. Nothing about a belief makes it permanent except your continued agreement with it. The difficulty is that most beliefs do not announce themselves clearly. They do not walk into your awareness wearing a label that says, "This is a belief you chose to accept." Instead, they disguise themselves as simple facts about reality, as obvious truths that seem too self-evident to question. Someone who grew up hearing that ambition leads to disappointment does not walk around consciously thinking, "I believe ambition leads to disappointment." They simply feel a quiet resistance whenever an exciting opportunity appears, a vague sense of caution that feels like wisdom rather than conditioning. This is what makes old beliefs so difficult to release. They do not feel like opinions you once absorbed. They feel like the honest, accurate shape of the world itself. Releasing a belief begins with exposing this disguise, and the way to expose it is through a very specific kind of honest questioning. When you notice a persistent limitation in your life, a pattern that repeats no matter how much effort you put toward changing it, pause and ask yourself where this pattern first started, not what caused it logically, but where you first learned to expect it. If you consistently hold back from asking for what you deserve, trace the feeling backward. Was there a specific moment, a specific person, a specific household atmosphere where asking for things directly was met with punishment, ridicule, or simply ignored? You are not doing this to assign blame or to spend years in painful analysis. You are doing this because a belief loses much of its authority the moment you can clearly see where it came from. It stops looking like an unchangeable law of the universe and starts looking like exactly what it is, a conclusion drawn by a younger version of you, based on limited information, doing the best it could with what it had at the time. Once you can see a belief clearly, the next step requires real honesty, because this is where many people get stuck. They intellectually recognize a belief is outdated, yet they continue acting exactly as they did before, because recognizing a belief and actually releasing it are two very different processes. Recognition happens in the mind. Release happens through repeated action that contradicts the old belief, until the belief no longer has enough supporting evidence to remain standing. If you believe, somewhere underneath the surface, that you are not the kind of person people choose first, you cannot simply think your way out of this belief through logic alone. You have to gather new evidence, deliberately, through action, even when that action feels uncomfortable and unfamiliar. You have to let yourself be visible, put yourself forward, accept invitations you would normally decline out of quiet self-protection, and let each of these small experiences slowly build a different case in your mind, one experience at a time. There is a particular kind of resistance that shows up specifically when you try to release an old belief, and it deserves to be named honestly because it surprises many people. Sometimes releasing an old belief feels like losing something familiar, even when that belief was clearly harmful. This happens because old beliefs, no matter how limiting, often provided a strange kind of safety. A belief that says, "It is safer to stay small," protects a person from the specific pain of trying and failing publicly. Releasing that belief means accepting the possibility of failure again, this time without the old excuse to soften the blow. This is why some part of you may quietly resist growth, not because it wants you to remain unhappy, but because it is trying, in a confused way, to protect you from a pain it remembers from long ago. Understanding this softens the process considerably. You are not fighting some enemy inside yourself. You are gently retraining a part of yourself that was only ever trying to keep you safe, using outdated information. A practical method for releasing old beliefs involves writing them down clearly, in plain language, without softening them to sound more acceptable. Write the belief exactly as it actually operates inside you, even if it sounds harsh on paper. I believe good things do not last. I believe I have to struggle to deserve rest. I believe people eventually leave once they really know me. Seeing these sentences in your own handwriting or your own typing creates a kind of separation between you and the belief. You start to notice that you are the one observing the belief, which means you cannot be entirely identical to the belief itself. This separation is where real change becomes possible, because you cannot release something you are still completely fused with. The moment you can look at a belief and recognize it as something you picked up rather than something you fundamentally are, you gain the ability to set it down. After writing the old belief clearly, write its replacement directly underneath it, not as a fantasy but as a statement you are willing to practice believing gradually. If the old belief was, "I believe good things do not last," the replacement might be, "I am someone who can hold on to good things and take care of them." Read both sentences side by side occasionally, not to dwell on the old one, but to notice clearly which direction you are walking now. This exercise works best when repeated over weeks, rather than treated as a single one-time fix. Old beliefs, especially ones formed early in life, rarely dissolve after a single confrontation. They loosen gradually, the same way a knot loosens through patient, repeated working rather than one hard pull. Real-world application of this principle shows up powerfully in relationships, where old beliefs about worth and safety operate constantly beneath the surface of everyday interactions. Someone carrying an old belief that conflict always leads to abandonment will avoid necessary conversations, swallow legitimate frustrations, and slowly build quiet resentment instead of addressing issues directly. Releasing this belief does not mean becoming reckless or combative. It means practicing small moments of honest disagreement in low-stakes situations first, noticing that the relationship survives, that the other person does not disappear simply because a disagreement occurred. Each survived moment of honesty becomes new evidence, slowly rewriting what conflict actually means, until eventually honesty feels less like danger and more like simply how healthy relationships function. It is worth acknowledging directly that releasing old beliefs can bring up grief, and this deserves respect rather than dismissal. Sometimes the belief you are releasing is tied to a person who taught it to you, someone you may have loved deeply despite their limitations. Letting go of a belief they passed down can feel, briefly, like letting go of a piece of the relationship itself. This feeling is valid and does not need to be rushed through. You can honor where a belief came from, understand the limited circumstances that produced it, and still choose not to carry it forward into your own future. Releasing a belief is not a rejection of where you came from. It is simply a decision that where you came from does not have to determine where you are going. Begin this practice today by identifying one belief that has quietly limited you for longer than you would like to admit. Trace its origin honestly. Write it down plainly, without softening it. Then write, directly beneath it, the belief you are choosing to build instead, and look for one small action today that gives this new belief some actual evidence to stand on. Old beliefs held their position for years through repetition alone, not because they were true. New beliefs can claim that same position, built the same patient way, through repetition, action, and the simple, steady decision to stop automatically believing everything you were taught to believe without question. Chapter 6. Build a new self-image through daily mental practice. Picture, for a moment, a thermostat set to a specific temperature. No matter how hot the room gets from outside sources, the thermostat will eventually pull the temperature back down to its setting. No matter how cold it gets, the same thing happens in reverse. The room can fluctuate temporarily, but it always drifts back toward whatever the thermostat has been set to maintain. Your self-image works in almost exactly this way. It is the internal setting your mind quietly maintains, and no matter how much external success or external failure you experience, your circumstances tend to drift back toward whatever your self-image has been calibrated to accept as normal. This is why some people who win large amounts of money end up broke again within a few years, and why some people who lose everything manage to rebuild it repeatedly. The external event was temporary. The internal setting was the real controlling factor the entire time. This explains something that confuses many people who work hard on their goals, but never seem to hold on to their progress. They achieve a promotion, and within months, they find a way to sabotage it through small mistakes or missed opportunities. They lose weight through disciplined effort, and within a year, the weight quietly returns, almost as if pulled back by some invisible force. The invisible force is not mysterious once you understand it clearly. It is the self-image, still set to its old configuration, working steadily in the background to restore the outer world to a state that matches its internal setting. You cannot outrun a self-image through willpower alone. You can only recalibrate it directly, and recalibration happens through consistent, deliberate mental practice, repeated daily, the same way physical training reshapes a body over months rather than overnight. The word practice matters here more than most people initially realize, because a self-image is not changed through a single dramatic realization, no matter how powerful that realization feels in the moment. Insight can open a door, but walking through that door requires repetition. This is precisely why so many people feel temporarily inspired after a powerful conversation, an emotional book, or a moving speech, only to find themselves back in old patterns within a few days. The inspiration touched their thoughts but never reached deep enough to reset the underlying self-image, because resetting a self-image requires the same quality that builds any lasting skill: daily, unglamorous repetition, performed consistently even when it does not feel exciting. A daily mental practice for building a new self-image does not need to be complicated or time-consuming to be effective. In fact, simplicity tends to work better than complexity, because a complicated practice is far easier to abandon after a few busy days. The core of the practice involves spending a few focused minutes, ideally at a consistent time each day, mentally rehearsing yourself as the person you are working to become, not through vague hoping but through specific, sensory detail. This is different from simply repeating a phrase. Repeating words alone reaches only the surface of the mind. Combining words with a clear inner picture, a felt sense of how that version of you moves, speaks, and carries themselves, reaches much deeper, closer to where the actual self-image lives. Choose a specific moment from your day, something ordinary rather than dramatic, and mentally rehearse yourself moving through it as your upgraded self-image. If you are working to build the self-image of someone who handles stress calmly, do not simply imagine a vague future where stress no longer exists. Instead, picture a specific, realistic situation, perhaps a tense meeting or an unexpected problem at home, and mentally walk through that exact scenario with steady breathing, a settled voice, and clear thinking. Run through this scene slowly, noticing details, the weight of your own calm presence in the room, the measured pace of your words, the absence of that familiar tightness in your chest. This kind of specific, repeated mental rehearsal builds new neural familiarity with a version of yourself that used to feel foreign, until eventually it stops feeling foreign at all. Morning and evening tend to work particularly well for this practice, not because of any special magic attached to those hours, but because the mind is naturally quieter and more receptive during these transition points of the day. In the morning, before the noise of obligations fully takes over, a few minutes of mental rehearsal sets a tone that tends to carry forward into how you actually move through the hours ahead. In the evening, right before sleep, the mind is winding down from active thinking, and whatever you focus on during this time tends to settle more deeply, partly because it becomes some of the last material your mind processes before rest. Choosing even one of these windows consistently matters far more than trying to practice constantly throughout a chaotic day and eventually giving up from exhaustion. There is an important detail that separates effective mental practice from wasted effort, and it involves the difference between forcing a feeling and allowing one. If you sit down and aggressively try to force yourself to feel confident while gritting your teeth through the exercise, you actually reinforce tension rather than confidence. The nervous system reads force as stress, not as safety, and stress tends to strengthen old patterns rather than new ones. Effective mental practice happens in a relaxed state, almost playful in its lightness, more like gently trying on a new piece of clothing than like fighting your way into something too tight. Let your shoulders drop. Let your breathing slow down naturally before you begin. Approach the practice the way you would approach a quiet daydream rather than a strict military drill, and the results tend to arrive far more smoothly. Consistency matters more than intensity in this entire process, and this deserves real emphasis because many people quit too early, expecting large, dramatic shifts after just a few sessions. A new self-image does not form after 5 minutes of practice performed once or twice. It forms the same way a path forms through a field of tall grass, not through a single walk, but through the same route walked repeatedly, day after day, until the path becomes visible and eventually becomes the easiest, most natural way to move through that space. 5 focused minutes practiced daily for months will reshape a self-image far more effectively than one intense hour practiced occasionally and then forgotten for weeks at a time. This is not a limitation of the method. It is simply how the mind actually forms lasting patterns, and working with this reality produces far better results than fighting against it with impatience. Something worth watching for during this process is the gap between your current circumstances and the self-image you are building, because this gap can feel uncomfortable, sometimes even a little painful, especially in the early weeks. You may spend 5 minutes picturing yourself as calm and capable, then immediately step into a day that still contains the same stress, the same triggers, the same old patterns showing up in familiar ways. This gap does not mean the practice is failing. It means you are in the middle of a transition, the same uncomfortable middle stage that exists in nearly every kind of meaningful growth. A plant does not go directly from seed to full bloom. It moves through an awkward, unglamorous middle stage that offers little visible reward, even though real growth is happening quietly beneath the surface the entire time. Trust this stage rather than abandoning the practice simply because the outer world has not caught up yet. Real-world application becomes visible gradually, often in small moments you might almost miss if you are not paying attention. You may notice one ordinary afternoon that you responded to a frustrating situation with a steadiness that would have been unthinkable for you a year earlier, and you did not even have to think hard about it. This is the self-image working exactly as intended, no longer requiring conscious effort because it has become the new, natural setting. These small moments deserve to be noticed and appreciated deliberately when they happen, because acknowledging them reinforces the new pattern further, giving your mind clear evidence that the daily practice is actually producing real change, not just wishful thinking performed in isolation. Begin tonight or tomorrow morning, whichever feels more natural for your daily rhythm. Choose one specific version of yourself you want to strengthen, something concrete enough to picture clearly rather than something vague and abstract. Spend just a few unhurried minutes mentally rehearsing a realistic scene featuring this version of yourself, breathing easily, letting the image settle rather than forcing it into place. Return to this same practice tomorrow, and the day after that, treating it with the same seriousness you would give to training any skill worth having. The self-image you carry right now was built through years of repetition you were not consciously directing. The new one, calmer, steadier, more capable, can be built the same way. Through repetition, you are now finally directing on purpose, one quiet daily session at a time. Chapter 7. Transform your thoughts before you transform your circumstances. Most people wait for their circumstances to change before they allow themselves to think differently. They tell themselves, quietly, that once the money improves, they will finally relax. Once the relationship gets easier, they will finally feel secure. Once the body heals, they will finally feel capable again. This order feels logical on the surface, almost obvious, and yet it is precisely backward, and understanding why it is backward changes everything about how you approach difficulty. Circumstances rarely improve first, and thought second. Thought improves first, consistently and deliberately, and circumstances follow behind, sometimes slowly, sometimes quickly, but almost always as a result rather than a cause. Consider two people facing the exact same financial pressure, the same tight month, the same stack of bills sitting on the counter. One person spends their mental energy replaying the problem over and over, rehearsing worst-case outcomes, feeling their chest tighten every time they glance at the stack. Their thoughts remain fixed entirely on lack, on what is missing, on how unfair the situation feels. The other person, facing identical numbers, deliberately redirects their thinking toward solutions, toward what skills they have available, toward which specific action they can take within the next hour, rather than the entire unsolved problem all at once. Neither person has changed their bank balance yet. But one of them is already moving, already generating ideas, already noticing opportunities their anxious counterpart is too overwhelmed to see. This is not a coincidence. Anxious, repetitive thinking narrows attention down to threat alone, while calm, directed thinking opens attention wide enough to notice possibility. The circumstance did not create this difference. The thought pattern did. This is why simply enduring difficult circumstances while continuing to think the same anxious, defeated thoughts rarely produces real change, even when the person is technically working hard and taking action. Action taken from a place of fear tends to be reactive, scattered, and driven by desperation rather than clarity. It looks like effort from the outside, but it lacks the steady direction that comes from a mind that has already settled into calm before beginning. This is why some people can work incredibly hard for years without meaningful progress, while others make significant progress in a much shorter time with what looks like less visible struggle. The difference is rarely the amount of effort. It is the quality of thought underneath the effort, quietly determining whether that effort moves in a clear direction or simply spins in place. Transforming your thoughts before your circumstances does not mean ignoring real problems or pretending difficulties do not exist. This is an important distinction because this principle gets misunderstood often, twisted into a kind of denial that refuses to look honestly at genuine challenges. Real thought transformation is not about closing your eyes to what is actually happening. It is about choosing, deliberately, which thoughts you allow to occupy the most space in your mind while you deal with what is actually happening. You can fully acknowledge a difficult diagnosis, a lost job, a broken relationship, without spending every waking hour rehearsing catastrophe. Acknowledging reality and drowning in repetitive fear about that reality are two very different mental activities, even though they often get treated as the same thing. A practical starting point involves catching yourself mid-thought, specifically during moments when your mind has drifted into repetitive worry without your conscious permission. Most people do not choose their anxious thought loops deliberately. These loops simply start running on their own, triggered by a passing reminder of the problem, and once running, they tend to repeat the same handful of worries over and over without producing any new insight or useful action. The moment you notice this loop running, and noticing itself is a skill that improves with practice, you have a choice point available to you that did not exist while the loop was running unnoticed in the background. At this choice point, you can ask yourself a simple, practical question. Is this thought producing anything useful right now, or is it simply repeating itself without moving anywhere new? If the thought is not producing anything useful, you have full permission to redirect your attention elsewhere, not through suppression, but through genuine redirection towards something more constructive. Redirection works best when you give your mind something specific to move toward, rather than simply telling yourself to stop thinking about the problem. Telling an anxious mind to stop thinking about something is like telling a child not to think about a particular toy. The instruction itself keeps the forbidden thing front and center. Instead, offer your mind a specific, engaging alternative. If you notice yourself spiraling about an uncertain outcome, redirect deliberately toward planning one small, concrete action you can take today, however minor. If you notice yourself spiraling about a relationship conflict, redirect toward recalling a specific memory of connection with that person, something real and grounding rather than vague and forced. The mind needs somewhere specific to land. Vague redirection rarely holds. Specific redirection tends to work much more reliably. There is also real value in examining the actual content of your habitual thoughts, not just during moments of crisis, but during ordinary days when nothing particularly stressful is happening. Many people carry a quiet undertone of scarcity or dread through completely neutral moments without ever noticing it. Because it has become so familiar, it feels like simply how thinking works. Pay attention, over the course of an ordinary day, to what your mind defaults to during unstructured moments, waiting in line, driving, washing dishes. These unguarded moments reveal your true habitual thought patterns more honestly than moments when you are actively trying to think positively. If you notice a consistent undertone of worry even during calm, uneventful stretches of your day, this is valuable information, showing you exactly where your daily mental practice needs the most attention. Building new thought patterns requires the same patient repetition as any other meaningful skill, and expecting instant results here creates unnecessary discouragement. A single session of deliberately calm, constructive thinking will not permanently override years of habitual worry, the same way a single healthy meal does not undo years of poor nutrition. What matters is the accumulated pattern over time, the steady practice of catching unhelpful thoughts and redirecting them, repeated daily across weeks and months, until calm, constructive thinking gradually becomes the more familiar, more accessible default, rather than the effortful exception. Real-world application shows up most clearly during periods of genuine uncertainty, when outcomes have not yet been decided and your mind has nothing concrete to hold on to except the story it tells itself while waiting. During these periods, two people with identical uncertain circumstances will often produce very different experiences of that uncertainty, based entirely on the thought patterns they maintain while waiting. One person will exhaust themselves through repeated catastrophic rehearsal, arriving at the actual outcome already depleted, regardless of what that outcome turns out to be. The other person will maintain steady, constructive thinking throughout the waiting period, arriving at the outcome with far more energy and clarity available, whether the news turns out to be good or difficult. The circumstance was identical for both people. The experience, and often the eventual response to that circumstance, was shaped almost entirely by the thought pattern maintained while waiting for it to unfold. Begin today by noticing one repetitive thought pattern that has been running quietly in the background of your ordinary moments, not just your crisis moments. Notice where it tends to appear, what triggers it, and whether it produces anything useful or simply repeats itself without progress. Practice catching it early, and offer your mind something specific and constructive to redirect toward instead. This single practice, repeated consistently, does not simply make difficult circumstances feel more bearable. It changes the quality of the actions you take while facing those circumstances, and it is the actions taken from a clear, steady mind that ultimately reshape the circumstances themselves, proving, day after day, that the order was never backward to begin with. Chapter 8. Practice living from the end you truly desire. Most people live from the middle of their story, endlessly focused on the problem currently in front of them, checking constantly for evidence that things are getting better or worse, never quite settling into the feeling of the ending they actually want. Living from the end is a different orientation entirely. It means placing your attention, your inner posture, and your emotional state not on the unfinished middle of the situation, but on the completed outcome, as though it has already happened, and allowing that completed feeling to guide how you move through the actual middle you are still walking through. This sounds unusual at first, maybe even a little uncomfortable, because it goes against the instinct to stay anxiously focused on the problem until it resolves. But this instinct, though common, rarely produces the calm clarity needed to actually reach a good resolution. Think about the difference between a person driving toward a destination while staring anxiously at the road directly in front of their headlights versus a person who has a clear picture of the destination already in mind, glancing at the road but never losing sight of where they are actually headed. The first driver reacts to every bump and curve as if it might be the end of the journey. The second driver experiences the same bumps and curves but interprets them differently, simply as part of the road that leads to a destination they already trust they will reach. Living from the end works the same way. The obstacles along the path do not disappear, but the meaning you assign to them changes completely once you have a settled sense of where you are actually going, rather than treating every difficulty as proof that you might never arrive. Practicing this requires building a clear, felt sense of the end you actually want, not a vague wish, but a specific, lived-in feeling. This differs slightly from simple imagination, which tends to focus on pictures and scenes. Living from the end goes a layer deeper into the emotional and physical sensation of already having what you want. If you desire financial stability, do not simply picture a number in a bank account. Feel, right now, in your body, the specific quality of ease that comes with financial stability, the relaxed shoulders, the steady breathing, the absence of that tight, clenched feeling in your stomach every time an unexpected expense appears. This feeling is available to you in small doses right now, in this very moment, even before your bank account has caught up to match it. And accessing this feeling deliberately, repeatedly, is the actual practice being described here. A useful way to begin this practice is to ask yourself a very specific question about your desired outcome. How would I feel, right now, if this were already true? Not how would I feel about the outcome in some distant celebratory moment, but how would the ordinary, unremarkable parts of my day feel differently if this were already settled? If you desire a peaceful home, the celebratory image might be a joyful family gathering, but the more useful question asks how an ordinary Tuesday evening would feel if peace were already the settled reality. Perhaps it would feel like walking through the door without bracing yourself for tension, like being able to fully relax into a chair without half your attention still monitoring for conflict. This ordinary, unremarkable version of the feeling is actually more valuable for daily practice than the dramatic celebratory version, because ordinary moments make up the vast majority of your actual life. Once you have identified this specific felt sense, the practice becomes about returning to it deliberately, especially during moments when current circumstances seem to contradict it entirely. This is where real discipline enters, because it is easy to access a feeling of ease while everything is already going smoothly. The actual skill being built is accessing that same feeling of ease while circumstances have not yet caught up, while the bills are still sitting there unpaid, while the relationship still feels strained, while the health concern is still unresolved. This does not mean denying the current difficulty. It means refusing to let the current difficulty be the only thing determining your inner state, moment to moment, day after day. There is a specific danger worth naming clearly here, because this practice, if misunderstood, can slide into a kind of passive waiting that produces nothing. Living from the end is not a replacement for taking real, practical action in your actual circumstances. It is not sitting quietly, feeling good, while ignoring the concrete steps still required to move forward. The felt sense of the end is meant to inform your actions, not replace them. A person living from the end of financial stability does not simply feel calm while continuing reckless spending. They feel calm, and from that calm, clear state, they naturally make steadier, wiser financial decisions, because clear thinking tends to produce better choices than anxious, scattered thinking. The feeling and the action work together, each strengthening the other, rather than the feeling standing in as a substitute for effort. Real-world application of this practice often shows up most clearly in how you handle setbacks along the way, because setbacks are where the temptation to abandon the felt sense of the end becomes strongest. Something goes wrong, an unexpected bill arrives, a difficult conversation goes poorly, a plan falls through, and the immediate pull is to collapse entirely back into the anxious, unresolved feeling of the middle. This is precisely the moment where the practice matters most. Instead of allowing the setback to completely erase the felt sense you have been building, treat it as simply a bump in the road you already trust leads somewhere specific. Acknowledge the setback honestly, deal with whatever practical response it requires, and then, once the immediate response has been handled, deliberately return to the felt sense of the end you are living from, rather than letting the setback become the new permanent emotional resting place. This practice also changes how you interpret delay, which is often one of the hardest parts of pursuing any meaningful goal. Delay tends to feel, to the anxious mind, like evidence of failure, like proof that the desired outcome is not actually coming. But delay and failure are not the same thing, even though they can feel identical in the moment. A person living from the end understands delay differently, not as evidence against the outcome, but simply as the natural time required for circumstances to reorganize themselves to match the new inner state being cultivated. This understanding does not eliminate the discomfort of waiting, but it changes the quality of that waiting considerably, transforming it from anxious dread into something closer to patient, grounded confidence. The same quiet confidence a person feels while waiting for a letter they already know is coming, rather than one they fear might never arrive. Begin practicing this today by choosing one specific outcome you deeply want and identifying, clearly, the ordinary, everyday feeling that would accompany already having it. Access that feeling deliberately, for even a few minutes, right now, regardless of what your current circumstances actually look like. Return to this feeling throughout your day, especially during moments when circumstances seem to argue against it. Let this felt sense guide the small decisions you make along the way, trusting that the actions taken from this settled inner state will naturally align more closely with the outcome you are working toward than any action taken from anxious, middle-of-the-story thinking ever could. Chapter 9. Strengthen your faith in your own creative power. Faith, in the way this chapter uses the word, has nothing to do with religion, and it has nothing to do with blind hope either. Faith here means something much more grounded and practical, a settled trust in your own ability to influence the direction of your life through the way you think, feel, and act. This kind of faith is not something you either have or do not have permanently. It is a muscle, built through use, weakened through neglect, and available to anyone willing to train it deliberately, regardless of how uncertain or shaky it might feel at the starting point. Most people place their faith outside themselves without ever noticing they are doing it. They place faith in the economy to determine their financial future. They place faith in other people's opinions to determine their worth. They place faith in circumstances, in luck, in timing, in forces entirely beyond their control, while quietly withholding faith from the one factor that has been present in every single moment of their life so far, their own capacity to think clearly, choose deliberately, and act with consistency. This misplaced faith is not a character flaw. It is simply a habit, formed early, reinforced by a culture that often teaches people to look outward for permission and validation before trusting their own internal direction. But habits formed can be unformed, and faith placed outward can be redirected inward through the same patient practice used to build any other meaningful skill. Consider how strange it is that people often trust their own creative power in small, low-stakes areas of life without a second thought, yet doubt it entirely in the areas that matter most. A person will confidently decide what to cook for dinner, trusting their own judgment completely, choosing ingredients and adjusting flavors without needing anyone's permission. Yet that same person may feel completely paralyzed when it comes to trusting their own judgment about a career change, a difficult relationship decision, or a significant creative project. The difference is not actual capability. The difference is simply how much faith has been practiced in that particular area. Faith, like any skill, grows stronger in the specific areas where it gets exercised regularly and stays weak in areas where it has been avoided out of fear. Building faith in your own creative power begins with recognizing evidence you likely already possess but have overlooked. Nearly everyone, if they pause and think honestly, can recall at least one moment where their clear intention, followed by consistent action, produced a real result that would not have happened otherwise. Perhaps it was learning a skill that once felt impossible, navigating a difficult situation that once seemed unsolvable, or building something from very little through sheer persistence. These moments often get dismissed too quickly, treated as lucky exceptions rather than proof of a real capability. Part of strengthening faith involves deliberately collecting this evidence, writing it down if necessary, and reviewing it during moments of doubt, not to inflate ego, but to remind yourself honestly of a pattern that already exists within your own history. There is an important distinction between faith and certainty that deserves careful attention here, because confusing the two creates unnecessary pressure. Certainty means knowing exactly how something will unfold, down to the details, with no ambiguity remaining. Faith does not require this level of certainty at all. Faith simply means trusting that your consistent effort, applied with clear intention, tends to move things in a favorable direction over time, even without knowing the exact mechanism or timeline in advance. A skilled gardener does not know the precise day a seed will sprout, nor can they control the weather completely, yet they still plant with confidence because they trust the underlying process enough to act despite the uncertainty. This is the kind of faith worth building, not a demand for guaranteed outcomes, but a steady trust in a process you have chosen to commit to fully. Practicing this faith daily involves taking small, deliberate risks, specifically chosen because they stretch your comfort zone without overwhelming it completely. Faith rarely strengthens through massive, dramatic leaps, taken all at once. It strengthens gradually, the same way physical endurance builds through progressively challenging training rather than a single overwhelming effort. Choose one small area this week where you have been holding back out of self-doubt, and act despite the doubt. Not because the doubt has disappeared, but because you have decided the doubt no longer gets to make the final decision. Perhaps this means sharing an idea you have been sitting on quietly, applying for something you assumed you were not ready for, or simply making a decision without seeking excessive reassurance from everyone around you first. Each of these small actions, completed despite lingering uncertainty, deposits a small amount of real evidence into your growing sense of faith. Setbacks during this process deserve particular attention because how you interpret a setback determines whether your faith grows stronger or weaker from the experience. Two people can face an identical failed attempt, and one will conclude that failure proves they have no real creative power, while the other will conclude that failure simply provided useful information for the next attempt. The event itself was the same. The interpretation, entirely within your control, determined the effect that event had on your faith going forward. Building strong faith requires actively choosing the second interpretation, deliberately, especially when the first one feels more emotionally convincing in a painful moment. This is not about denying disappointment. It means refusing to let a single setback rewrite your entire sense of capability, the same way a single rainy day does not disprove the existence of the sun. A practical daily habit for strengthening this faith involves briefly reviewing, each evening, one moment from the day where you acted from trust rather than fear, however small that moment might have been. This does not need to be dramatic. It might simply be speaking up in a meeting instead of staying silent, or following through on a commitment to yourself despite feeling tired. Acknowledging these small moments deliberately trains your attention to notice your own consistency, which is precisely the evidence faith needs to grow. Most people move through their days without ever pausing to notice the moments where they already demonstrated real trust in themselves, and this oversight quietly starves their faith of the recognition it needs to strengthen further. Real-world application of strengthened faith becomes especially visible during periods of genuine difficulty, when external circumstances offer little immediate encouragement. A person with weak faith in their own creative power tends to collapse quickly during these periods, interpreting difficulty as proof that effort is pointless. A person who has been deliberately strengthening this faith over time responds differently, not because the difficulty feels any less real, but because they have built a track record, both internal and external, of moving through hard periods before and coming out the other side with something valuable intact. This track record becomes a quiet source of steadiness precisely when steadiness matters most, allowing continued action even when visible progress has temporarily disappeared from view. Begin today by identifying one small area where self-doubt has been quietly making your decisions for you. Choose one specific, manageable action within that area and complete it despite the discomfort, treating the discomfort as simply part of the process rather than a signal to stop. Review this action tonight, acknowledging it honestly as evidence of your own capability, however small it may seem in the moment. Faith in your own creative power grows the same way any other strength grows, through repeated use, consistent practice, and an honest willingness to keep trusting the process even before the results have fully arrived to confirm it. Chapter 10. Commit to becoming the person you were meant to be. Everything covered so far has led toward this final point, because knowledge without commitment simply becomes another interesting idea stored away and eventually forgotten, and this book was never meant to be another interesting idea. Understanding how identity shapes circumstances means nothing if it does not eventually turn into a daily decision to act differently. Recognizing the power of imagination means nothing if it stays confined to a single afternoon of curiosity. The difference between someone whose life genuinely transforms and someone who simply enjoyed reading about transformation comes down to one word, and that word is commitment. Not motivation, which rises and falls unpredictably depending on mood and circumstance. Commitment, which holds steady precisely because it does not depend on feeling inspired every single day. Commitment looks unglamorous in practice, and this needs to be said honestly, because many people quietly expect transformation to feel exciting and dramatic every step of the way. Real commitment often looks like showing up to the same small practice on a day when nothing about it feels meaningful, on a day when the old identity feels more comfortable than the new one you have been building, on a day when no one would notice or applaud you for continuing anyway. This is precisely where most people quietly give up, not during the dramatic crisis moments, but during the ordinary, unremarkable Tuesday afternoons when it would be so easy to simply skip the practice just this once. Commitment is built in exactly these unremarkable moments, far more than in any single dramatic turning point. Becoming the person you were meant to be is not about discovering some hidden, perfect version of yourself that has been waiting, fully formed, somewhere beneath the surface. That framing, though popular, creates a strange kind of pressure, as if you are searching for something rather than building something. The more accurate and far more empowering understanding is that this future version of you is not waiting to be found. It is waiting to be built, deliberately, through the exact practices covered throughout this book. The identity you assume before the proof arrives, the imagination you train with specific detail, the feelings you deliberately cultivate, the beliefs you examine and release, the self-image you rehearse daily, the thoughts you redirect consistently, the felt sense of the end you practice living from, and the faith you strengthen through repeated small risks. None of this requires you to discover anything mystical about yourself. It simply requires you to keep choosing, day after day, even on the days that offer no visible reward for choosing well. There is a particular kind of fear that shows up specifically at this stage, once someone has understood the principles clearly and stands at the actual threshold of committing to them long term. This fear is different from the fear of failure. It is closer to the fear of responsibility, because once you fully understand that your identity, your thoughts, and your daily practices genuinely shape your circumstances, you lose access to a certain kind of comfortable excuse. It becomes harder to blame external circumstances entirely, harder to remain a passive character in your own story. This can feel unexpectedly heavy at first, almost like a burden rather than a gift. But sit with this feeling a little longer, past the initial discomfort, and something shifts. This same responsibility that initially feels heavy is actually the very thing that hands you real power. A person who believes their circumstances are entirely determined by outside forces has no real lever to pull. A person who understands their own role clearly has a lever available every single day, and while that lever requires effort to pull, its mere existence is what makes genuine change possible at all. Commitment also requires releasing the fantasy of a single dramatic finish line where the work of self-improvement finally ends and life simply coasts along effortlessly from that point forward. This fantasy, though comforting to imagine, sets people up for disappointment and eventual abandonment of good practices, because real growth does not work this way. There is no final chapter where you arrive completely finished, no version of yourself so fully built that daily practice becomes unnecessary. This is not discouraging news once you understand it correctly. It simply means the relationship you are building with your own growth is ongoing, similar to how physical health requires continued care rather than a single achievement followed by permanent maintenance-free results. The goal is not to finish. The goal is to become someone who continues showing up consistently, treating daily practice not as a temporary project with an end date, but as simply how you now choose to live. A practical way to sustain this commitment over the long term involves building small, specific rituals around the practices covered throughout this book, rather than relying on willpower alone to remember them each day. Willpower fluctuates, but ritual, once established, becomes far more automatic and far less dependent on daily motivation. Attach your identity practice, your mental rehearsal, your moment of gratitude for evidence of faith to something you already do consistently, right after your morning coffee, right before turning off the light at night, during a specific stretch of your commute. This attachment transforms an abstract intention into a concrete habit, anchored to an existing routine, making it far more likely to survive the inevitable busy weeks and tired days that would otherwise cause it to quietly disappear. Setbacks along this long journey deserve one final word of honest reassurance, because commitment does not mean perfect, unbroken consistency stretching endlessly without a single missed day. Real commitment includes missed days, forgotten practices, entire weeks where old patterns quietly crept back in and took over again. What separates genuine commitment from a temporary phase is not the absence of these lapses, but the willingness to return afterward, without excessive self-criticism, without treating a missed week as proof that the entire effort was pointless. A person committed to this journey simply comes back, again and again, calmly, the same way a person committed to physical fitness returns to the gym after an illness or a busy travel week, without treating the interruption as a permanent failure. This willingness to return, repeatedly, over months and years, is the actual substance of commitment, far more than any single unbroken streak could ever be. Think for a moment about the person reading these words right now, and the person who will exist 1 year from today if these practices are actually applied with reasonable consistency during that time. That future version of you is not a fantasy disconnected from your current reality. That version is being built, quietly, decision by decision, starting from this exact moment, through the small choices you make in the days immediately following this book, rather than through some distant, dramatic transformation arriving all at once. The gap between who you are today and who you are capable of becoming is not closed through a single powerful realization, however meaningful that realization might feel while reading it. It is closed through the accumulated weight of small, consistent choices, repeated patiently, long after the initial excitement of reading about them has faded into the ordinary rhythm of daily life. This is the real invitation at the center of everything covered throughout this book, more important than any single technique or practice on its own. The invitation is simply this: choose to keep going. Choose it today, and choose it again tomorrow, and choose it again on the day after that, especially on the days when choosing feels difficult, unrewarding, or entirely unnoticed by anyone else around you. The person you are meant to become is not a distant destination waiting somewhere far off in the future, disconnected from your current life. That person is being built right now, in this very moment, through the simple, quiet decision to close this book and actually begin, not perfectly, not all at once, but consistently, one deliberate choice at a time, starting today.